Okay, hey everyone, this is Mike at iWearShorts.com. Today I'm going to show you how to make two-way communication between a web, sort of a locally hosted website on your native iOS app and your native iOS app. So basically this is a situation where you want to say, I want to run some Swift code when my Webview says something, and I want to run some JavaScript code when my Swift view controller says something. So the use case for this, there's a lot of use cases, but commonly what you could do is make a native app for iOS that's mostly built with web technologies. A lot of the animations and stuff are done in an HTML5 web view, and then you're really just pinging back and forth when you need native functionality or you need to do something on the native app itself. So maybe adjust settings or whatnot. So that's the use case. Let's dive right into it. I'm going to start at the very beginning and with even dragging on a UI web view, so feel free to skip ahead if this is too basic. I just want to make sure that I'm getting everything in there so that people understand what's going on. So here I've got this, it's my view controller. All I've done basically is create a new project, a single view application. I'm using Swift today, and basically what this is a UI view controller, and I'm going to get a web view on this. So this is my first task of the day. What I want to do is drag this guy on here, and this is great. However, I'm using this free-form square of a view controller here. So this doesn't tell me if I'm in the right dimensions for an iPhone 6 or a 5 or an iPad or what have you. So I want my web view, since this is going to be the main part of my application, to scale appropriately to any device. So I want to set this web view here to take up the full amount of width and height of the page. So I'm just going to click on my dependencies here, and I'm just going to click all of these 4 constraints. So that's going to push the web view out to the sides and the top and the bottom, and I'm just going to click Add 4 Constraints. And you can see if I pull up my little scene inspector here that I have all 4 constraints. I can mouse over these and see where they are. They look good to me. So the next thing is I need to connect this web view to my view controller itself. So here's my view controller. And I want to be able to manipulate this web view in my view controller. So I'm going to give myself a little bit more space and open up my counterpart view here. And I'm just going to give myself some room, and then while holding control, just control and drag this UI web view onto my view controller. And you can see it pops up with a UI web view, and it wants to make an IB outlet. So we'll do that. We'll name it web view here, and that's it. Now I've got something that I can work with. So we're going to save the storyboard and go into our view controller in sort of a single editing mode. So now that we've gotten this web view into our view controller in a way that we can manipulate it, I want to load this web view up with an HTML a website, basically. So what I've got here, if I open up NetBeans, I've got this index.html file. And if you look at my folder structure, it's just sitting in this folder called web. And then here's my Xcode application. So you can see here, if I look at Xcode, I don't have a web folder in here yet. And I need to be able to access that if I want to load my web view with index.html. So I need to get my web folder into my project, and I'll do that. It's actually very simple. I'm just going to drag my web view into my project hierarchy, and Xcode is actually going to create groups up here for me by default. Now I want to create folder references, and you can tell very easily if you've done the wrong thing, because when you click finish, the folder will be yellow instead of blue. You want it to be blue. You want to create those folder references. That way your index.html file can call images locally and other CSS files and JS files. So there we go. I've imported my project. There's my web view. You can see it's in there. If I open that up in an editor, let me just navigate to that real quick. There's my index.file, my index.html file. I can tell that by editing this real quick. So if I run this, oh, whoops, we haven't set it up yet. You can see I get a blank screen. Basically, that's because I haven't loaded the UI Webview with my index.html file yet. So in order to do that, you could use this viewDidLoad function here. But I'm actually going to override another function that Xcode gives us, and that's going to be viewWillAppear. And basically, the difference between viewDidLoad and viewWillAppear is pretty obvious. ViewWillAppear runs slightly before viewDidLoad. It's a function that runs just before the view is going to fully load and ready to display on the page. So this is where I want to try to load up my web view and get a jump on things to make it as quick as possible. So in here, all I'm going to do is use a structure that's sort of unique to Swift, or it's not completely unique to Swift, but it's a very useful programming design pattern. And what we're going to call this, we're just going to call an if statement here, and then we're going to define a block of code. And if that block of code gets defined, we're going to run something inside of that block of code. So here, we're just going to define a URL, let URL be, and we're going to access our main bundle here. So our nsBundle.mainBundle. And now we're going to load up a URL for resource. And that URL for resource, if you look in web here, it's going to be index.html. So its name is index, the extension is HTML, and the subdirectory is web in this case. So that's the first step. So now if we were able to define this URL, we're going to run inside this block of code. Now I want you to be able to set up a URL fragment, let's say, just in case. Let's say you loaded an app from a local notification versus a user touch. You want to be able to tell right away the context of your app, and so passing in a URL fragment might be really useful for that. So if we want to pass in a fragment here, all we'd have to do is define a frag URL here. And then we're going to instantiate an NS URL with a string. And that string is going to have a fragment in it, frag URL. And then the relative URL that we're going to instantiate it from is the URL that we were able to define in our if statement. So Xcode will complain about this because I'm not, this NS URL is actually going to return an optional. So now what I need to do is just unwrap that optional, and then let's define our request. So let request equal NS URL request, and let's instantiate the URL request with our URL, which is just frag URL in this case. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is set up our delegate methods. So we've got our web view in here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can receive a bunch of events coming from the web view itself. We have to set up a delegate for that. So let's do that right now. Let's say webview.delegate is equal to self, which is just saying let's make this view controller the web view delegate, and then let's load that request. So let's load request, and we'll pass in our request that we instantiated earlier. Now Xcode is going to complain here because I haven't set up the view controller to actually accept the web view delegate class. So let's do that, web view delegate, and you'll see that complaint goes away, and now we're ready to test it out. And you can see that I've loaded up hello world. I can tell that I'm editing the right file here by just adding a paragraph test, and if I try to run this again, we should see test below that. You can see that there. So at this point, we've passed in a URL fragment. Let's let's see if we can get that back out in JavaScript. Let's see if we can detect that. So on my window load here, let's just say var frag is equal to window.location.hash. And that's going to be the URL fragment. And then let's just alert that out to the page if we get it. So now, if we run this again, we should see an alert pop up. And you can see there's our frag URL that we defined right there. So if I click OK, my page loads. Perfect. OK, so at this point, you're probably wondering, OK, this is fine. Really fancy stuff. We're loading in a web view with a local website. I get it. How do we communicate between JavaScript and Swift? All right, so that's the next part. We need to set up our delegate method to first detect that we've made a URL request. So the way that we're going to communicate back and forth between our JavaScript and our Swift is basically in our JavaScript, we're going to make window location requests here. And as those requests go out, our Swift code here is going to intercept that request and look at the scheme. And if it's a custom scheme, then it's something that we can react to and maybe run a custom function in our code or set a setting, whatever we need to do. Then later we're going to ping back from Swift and run an actual JavaScript function in this code. So let's see how to do that. First, let's set up a request. So let's just make a button here. And this class is going to be click me. And then we're going to listen for a click event. And when a user clicks on that, we're going to make a custom schema request. So we can do that by saying window.location is equal to. And instead of http://stuff, whatever it is, let's change this to Mike. So now, when I click on the button, I'm going to make a request to Mike://stuff. OK, so now in Xcode, how do we listen for that? Well, there's a delegate method that we've gotten here. And if I give myself a bit more space, you can see Webview should start load with request. So that delegate method will actually listen for any URL requests and accept them and either stop them or let them go through. So let's just log out what these requests look like. And since our function here is demanding that we return some sort of a Boolean, let's just return true. OK, so now we should expect to log something out here when we see that request when we click our button. So if we run this demo, you can see we're pulling in that frag URL. And now our page loaded. When I click this click me button, you should see in our log files here that we are making a request. So I click that, and you can see my URL is Mike://stuff. So now what do we do with that? Well, let's respond. Let's say if it's an HTTP request, we're just going to return true and let it go through. If it's a Mike custom request, then we're going to do something. So we can test that again by if defining something. If let scheme be equal to the request.url, and that's an optional URL. You can see here my code even tells me this is an optional NS URL being returned here. So I need to define that as optional. And then we're going to pull out the scheme from it. And if we were able to define that, then we know we can now work with the scheme. So let's go ahead and test for Mike. So we've defined the scheme as Mike. We're going to test for Mike. And if it is Mike, we're going to do something. So if scheme is equal to Mike. Now we can do something. So let's say, first of all, we're going to return false because we don't want those requests going out to the web because who cares? I'm not going to get anything back anyway. So let's just log this and see what happens here. We got a Mike request, and let's log the scheme to see how that looks. So now, when I click the button, I expect to see some sort of a log here indicating what that scheme was and that we were able to detect the Mike request. So when I click the button, there it is. You can see we got a Mike request and the scheme is Mike. Okay, so that's great. Let's say now that this was sort of the ping and we want to respond to this somehow. Well, we can do that by running a function inside of this called, let's see here, string by evaluating JavaScript from string. So basically what we're going to do here is pass a bit of a string in here that looks like a JavaScript function. So let's just say this is some JavaScript function. It looks like we're going to execute a JavaScript function here. So basically what that web view is going to do is now it's going to go through the global scope and it's going to look for something called some JavaScript function, and when it finds it, it's going to execute that function. So in my HTML file, I need to define, first of all, a globally defined function, and then I need to do something. So let's just alert we got a message from Swift. So now when I click the button, I should make a request to Mike.stuff or Mike://stuff. And when I find that we've made that request, I'm going to log it, and then I'm going to make a request back and run some JavaScript function, which should alert we got a message from Swift. So let's try this out. Okay, we detected that frag URL. Now when I click the button, we should see an alert pop up ultimately from the ping back and forth. So you can see it was very quick. I clicked the button, we got the request, we detected that it was a Mike request, and we ran that function. That function ran in JavaScript here, and it alerted out to the page we got a message from Swift. That's great. Okay, so now the only other thing to discuss with this, at this point we're able to communicate back and forth. We're able to run things from JavaScript and instantiate or react in Swift, and we're able to execute some JavaScript from within Swift as well. So the only other thing that we want to be able to do is test any sort of return functions in Swift here. So you can see that in my JavaScript, all I'm doing is alerting right now, but I could, actually, I could change this paragraph to be this message. So I can change this paragraph to be this message, and then I could also return true if I wanted. So now what this will do is change the paragraph from we got a message from to we got a message from Swift, and then it'll return true immediately. So in our Swift now, we can look for that result by defining another if-let statement. So if-let result is equal to, if we were able to define result, then we're going to log that out, result, and we're going to say result here, and now you should see the final log event here to be result. Or you should actually, that should say true somewhere in there. So anyway, if we run this function one more time, we click, and you can see we're changing that message, and when we log back out, we return the result of true, and we're actually logging that right here. So at this point, you have everything you need to communicate back and forth between a web application and a native iOS app, in this case running Swift. It would be the same process if you were doing Objective-C. The syntax, of course, would be a lot different, but it's sort of the same idea. Basically, you make a custom scheme request, and then you run the string by evaluating JavaScript from string function here, and that would be how you communicate back and forth. The only other note that I would say is these are global functions. If you didn't like that, if you didn't like defining a bunch of global functions and polluting the namespace, you could do something like this and say var mic equals an object literal, and then you could actually put this function inside of this string by evaluating JavaScript string from string, or whatever that function is called, will actually traverse into something like this. So now if I wanted to call this function here, I could say mic dot some JavaScript function, right? So it would be the same in JavaScript here in this string. So you would just paste that in there, mic dot some JavaScript function. Now if I was to run this, I would expect the same result. And you can see if I click, I get the same result. So that is it for today's lesson. Thanks for stopping by. If you have any questions, please leave a comment on iwearshorts.com. If not, good luck and happy coding.